My name is William Allen, and I am Benjamin Hale tonight. I don't look like Benjamin Hale, but I hope I can do honor to Ben, for he would normally be here to introduce the programs that are put on by the Center. And as you know, the Center engages in significant programming throughout the year. And it is our custom, certainly Director Pasnow's custom, at the opening of every program, to remind everyone of the mission of the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization, which is to say, to sponsor significant public discussions of topics that we all find to be gravely important, and to do so in an atmosphere in which we show mutual respect for one another and pursue the inquiry wherever it will lead without making demands upon one another to determine the outcome one way or the other. And so, in the spirit of Bob Pasnow, I remind us tonight that we are here to engage in robust discussion with complete civility. Having said that, I want to say that we have had several programs already this year. We've probably taxed you, and we're going to tax you more. There will be further programming throughout the year, particularly in this series on American national character. The first of the American national character lectures was delivered in September by Diana Schaub from Loyola University in Maryland. The talk tonight will be the second. There will be a third in the first week of December by Dr. Robert Zimmer, the president of the University of Chicago, who is known for very many things, but most especially for the Chicago Statement, the Chicago Principles on intellectual diversity and freedom of speech, which have played a significant role in tempering conversations on campuses around the country. Many other institutions have embraced the Chicago Statement as their own statement of their approach to handling controversial discussions on university campuses. So we look forward to Dr. Zimmer joining us to share with us his particular views on how we can go about making certain that the landscape of higher education truly reflects the mission of higher education, rather than being co-opted into the highly polarizing and divisive struggles that otherwise seem so frequently to characterize our current circumstances in the society. In that vein, tonight we will have a presentation that will, I don't know how long it will be, but it won't be overly long, I can tell from the typescript in front of me. That means there should be plenty of time for questions afterwards. We will, of course, moderate the questions loosely. In a group of this size, I'm quite certain we can be quite relaxed about that, and I know Dr. Sheehan is quite the master of handling conversation, particularly in groups that are of a scope that will allow free exchange of views without people stepping on one another. It is the case that we will, of course, open the question period with a nod to undergraduates. So for those undergraduates who are present, and you can remind any who might come in subsequently, we will look to you to raise your hands first, and then everyone else. Having said all that, I want to introduce our speaker for tonight, but I hardly need to do so. For as I look out, I can see that most of you have already met Dr. Colleen Sheehan. Dr. Sheehan is this year's visiting scholar in conservative thought and policy at the Benson Center. She comes to us from Villanova University in Pennsylvania, where she is a professor in the Department of Politics, or Political Science, as I should properly say, and also the founder of the Ryan Center at Villanova University, which is created to study the ideals and principles of the American founding. Dr. Sheehan has had an illustrious career. She has published in many of the leading journals and other outlets around the country in higher education and beyond. She has written very important books published with major publishers, two in particular on James Madison. James Madison's thought with regard to the spirit of republicanism, and most significantly, in a way that has shaped the scholarship of many people beyond the limits of political theory itself, the intellectual foundations of James Madison's project have been developed at great length by her. She has won awards for teaching excellence, and she has been noted for her public service. She has served as a legislator in the state of Pennsylvania, and served on commissions, higher education, and others besides. I could go on at great length about her numerous accomplishments. But perhaps I should sum this up and give her the floor by simply observing what I consider her most significant accomplishment of all. And that is to say, as one of the PhDs who pursued her training under my direction, she survived and thrived. I introduced Dr. Colleen Sheehan.
Thank you very much, Bill Allen. My friend and my mentor, from whom I learned a great deal, and who made the study of the founding even more vital to me than it would have been otherwise. I credit him for all that I am, but blame him for none of it too. So I want to thank too Bob Pasno and the current director of the Benson Center, and Ben Hale, who I think will be here later, who's the acting director, for their gracious hospitality. My husband and I have been here now in Boulder for 2 months, and the people have been some of the nicest people I have met anywhere that I have lived in the United States. And the people here at the university, and including the people in classes, I just feel it's just my pleasure and honor to have gotten to know. So I'm grateful to be here, and so is Jack. Now, I see everybody sitting on this side of the room. I don't know if that means you're sitting on the left side of the room or the right side of the room, because I guess it all depends on your perspective. So tonight I want to talk about American friendship. And I want to see what you think about this as well, because I think this is probably the question facing the nation today that is most difficult and perhaps most critical. In 2026, the United States will celebrate its 250th birthday. And you can count back and see where I started from to get that. At present, America is the longest living republic. But at the same time, she is also staring the possibility of dissolution in the face. We're a nation fractured, disunited, and hurting, inhibited by a large portion of Americans who don't like another large portion of Americans much at all. And among some, there's talk of separation, whether it be into 2 or 3 or in multiple sovereign entities. There's something now called Bluxit, the idea, which is an idea for some to separate, to secede, to escape Trumpian America. And there's also the notion of 3 federations, the blue, the red, and the neutral. And then there's the lucky 7. Look, we had a good run, Bonnie Christian writes in The Week, quote, "These United States were a great experiment, but the experiment has gotten out of hand. It's time to peacefully dissolve the Union," unquote. What's causing this talk of secession and dissolution? What is the discord primarily about? Is it about race, ethnicity, religion, gender, economics, class. No, the principal conflict is politics. It's about deeply held ideas. According to the Pew Foundation, an alarmingly high percentage of Americans view their political opponents as a threat to the common good, and the gap between the two sides to this day continues to widen. According to Sally Kohn in her book, The Opposite of Hate, A Field Guide to Restoring Our Humanity, not only incivility, but hate and cruelty are becoming all too common in American politics and culture today. Our national motto is E pluribus unum, out of many one, Kohn remarks. Quote, it's an ideal, if not always a reality, but represents the intended spirit of America, that we come together in spite of our differences, not ignoring them, unquote. The problem, Kohn believes, is not in our political disagreements. She doesn't see the problem as in our political disagreements. In fact, she says, quote, our different opinions and identities should be celebrated, unquote. Rather, she says, the problem's in how we express our differences and how we treat those with whom we disagree, as though they're inherently evil. Remember, Kohn says, that as important as our differences and disagreements are, we still have so much in common, unquote. Well, I agree that the way we often treat each other with whom we disagree is a real and serious problem in America today. I would also like to attend to the issue of the disagreement itself. Do we still have fundamental beliefs in common? So much so that we're able to celebrate our differences and yet remain civic friends. Today, many Americans do not believe in the ideas that animated the revolutionary and founding generation. As in 1860, which some of you in this room have been a period that you've been studying. As in 1860, we are again at loggerheads over who we are and what we stand for as a people. While both sides may speak the same language of equality and liberty, they define these principles in vastly different terms. The difference, perhaps a measurable difference, in the definition of these principles is due, I think, to the fundamentally different ways each side understands what it means to be human. What are the implications of these markedly dissimilar, even rival conceptions of humanity that fuel the contemporary political divide? Can we as a nation survive pursuing a live and let live philosophy, at least on the most essential questions? Take the case of the Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado Civil Rights Commission, probably a case many of you here are very familiar with. Take this case, for example. Can the two sides find a way to agree to disagree? Is there a way somehow just to let everybody eat cake? Or what about the recent legislation in Utah that aims to recognize and protect marriage rights of the LGBT, but also allow for religious exemptions? Is this a compromise that should serve as a model for the rest of the states? Or consider Roe versus Wade and the abortion debate, which continues unabated in the nation today. How can we possibly meld these clashing and contradictory views? In light of this serious disagreement about the purpose of America, how are we, American citizens, to celebrate our differences and our different opinions and identities, and yet sustain a healthy and united body politic? As Sally Kohn claims that we can do. Is it possible for a nation composed of citizens who disagree so fundamentally about what is right and wrong, just and unjust, remain united? Or do citizens of a Republican, small r Republican, polity have to share some fundamental principles that make them one people? Is civic friendship and concord necessary today? Is it even possible? The idea that a state or political community must have citizens who have something in common is a very old notion, prominently featured in the writings of the Greek political philosophers. According to Aristotle, quote, I like this quotation, the special business of the political art is to produce friendship, unquote. As the Constitution is a form of the political order, that which holds the polity together is civic friendship. From the ancient political philosophers, all cities are associations of families and individuals who hold something in common, and that shared object forms the basis of their political or civic friendship. While civic friendship is not identical to the close personal friendship that exists in families or between good friends, neither is it merely loose bonds of utility that connect individuals, groups, or cities on the basis of security or mere self-interest, whether political or economic. Given that security is the most immediate aim of the political order, safety, security, survival, civic friendship necessarily has a component of usefulness and advantage, but it also entails concord or like-mindedness. Aristotle says this, quote, "Concord also appears to be a mark of friendship. Thus it is not merely identity of opinion, for this might occur even among people who do not know each other." People could across the seas, across the land, have an opinion in common but not know each other. Nor do we say that people are in concord when they agree about just anything, but we say a city is in concord when the citizens agree about what is advantageous, choose the same actions, and act on what they have resolved to do in common, unquote. For Aristotle, then, civic friendship involves sharing a common opinion, though the coincidence of opinion is not sufficient grounds for this or for any other kind of friendship. The shared opinion among citizens must be of a certain sort, the kind that involves agreement about what is advantageous and just, which in turn forms a basis for public decisions and actions. So it's some kind of opinion about what is right, what is just, that forms the basis of a polity, Aristotle says. It should be noted that the kind of agreement that constitutes political concord for Aristotle does not require people to think exactly alike, nor to have identical passions or interests. Rather, citizens retain their individuality and diverse views, which enables them to deliberate on political matters. Nevertheless, they do share in common a view of justice, and in this sense, Aristotle says they are of the same mind, the best antidote to stasis or faction. So for Aristotle, the best antidote to the kind of divisions in society that disrupt society, even tear it apart, is sharing an opinion of justice in common. Furthermore, Aristotle argues, not all civic friendships are alike. There are two main kinds, one grounded in legal considerations and the other grounded in moral considerations. The first is based on prescribed agreement and the second on trust. Friendship based on legal considerations is relatively straightforward. It constitutes a legal bond among the members of the community, which results from contract and subsequently framed laws. This is the kind of connection you see in the early social contract theories of Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. It is also part of the argument pronounced by the laws themselves personified in Plato's Crito. You have to obey me because you agreed to it. Self-preservation, self-interest, and quid pro quo obedience to the law are the key factors here. For Aristotle, the political relationship among citizens is also comprised of a strong element of utility, which is required for the self-sufficiency and common good of the polity. Back to that stability, safety issue. However, political relationships based merely on usefulness and self-advantage, just like personal relationships based solely on utility, do not fulfill the requirements of genuine friendship, and thus are only very loosely referred to as such by Aristotle. Civic friendship, grounded in moral considerations, binds citizens together by more than contracts and laws. Too much talking. We have to let you do some of the talking. Such citizens are inspired by a concern for their polity and its way of life, and by goodwill towards the members of their city. They're not only concerned with their own security and economic well-being, but are attentive to the moral views and character of their fellow citizens. This is what the ancients considered the foundation of a true republic. So think of that, the legal bond among citizens that's a result of the social contract, an agreement to obey the laws, kind of a quid pro quo. You're expecting something back from the polity to protect you, to respect your rights in the modern republic. And then there's the kind of bond between citizens that's more than legal, which we might call political or moral, in the sense of it's based on trust. It's based on sharing something in common that citizens care about, sharing a view of justice in common, and actually knowing something about the character of your fellow citizens. For Aristotle, then, to be citizens of a genuine polity, the people do not all have to know each other intimately or even personally. However, to satisfy the conditions of civic friendship, the citizens do have to possess general knowledge of the political opinions and moral character of each other and care for their mutual improvement. In addition, they must deliberate together and act in common. To achieve this, Aristotle taught, they must live in, this is for Aristotle, they must live in one location, collectively participate in public festivals and institutions, provide for a common defense, undergo a common education, and intermarry. For these reasons, Aristotle argued that the polis must be small in size and limited in population. So, this is all well and good for the ancients, but we live in a very different world, and today different politically, geographically, technologically, economically, religiously, and culturally. In almost every way, it seems to be different. Given the momentous changes that have taken place from ancient to contemporary times, is there any sense in which Aristotle's notion of civic friendship might be helpful to us today, particularly with our hyper-factionalized politics? Alini Leoncini thinks so, at least in the limited sense in which there may be a common advantage among members of a pluralistic state. According to her, she says this, quote, Aristotelian civic friendship is a variety of the friendship of utility. We talked about that. Being a form of common advantage friendship, the kind of friendship as envisioned by Aristotle, could serve as an antidote to the alienating aspects of modernity. No matter how loosely this bond is to be understood, it can create concord, she says, in society and help us prevent civic strife and help satisfy the need for social unity without posing a threat to either liberty or justice. In this sense, she continues, Aristotle's notion of civic friendship could provide the basis for a meaningful political form of friendship that could foster social unity in the context of pluralism. Is that true? I think Leoncini is correct to point to Aristotle and the idea of civic friendship as a good medicine for the disruptive diseases of our time. But her supposition that there can be civic friendship in a pluralistic regime, a regime of merely difference, where things are not held in common, is, I think, a notion, in a nation of people who have no fundamental beliefs and principles in common, I think is mistaken. But maybe we'll talk about that more. In the absence of a shared cause grounded in common principles, the only thing that can bind people together is some version of self-interest, whether it's based on economic interest, a shared physical identity, or some other material likeness. But how can mutual self-interest create bonds of affection between political camps of people who feel hatred towards one another, each believing the other to be a serious menace to the common good? Certainly, Aristotle would strenuously reject the notion that there can be a genuine political order with meaningful civic concord in the absence of a shared regime principle. How are groups of people united on the basis of mutual self-interest only, but deeply divided over the essential purpose of their nation, to tolerate each other's perspective, let alone discover concord, when each believes the other would destroy what it loves? After all, hate is a response to those who would destroy what we love. That's precisely what hatred is, a response to those who would destroy what we love deeply. In contrast to the small, homogeneous classical polities, since its inception, the United States was envisioned as a large republic composed of a multiplicity and diversity of groups, especially a variety of economic interests and religious sects. According to the chief theorist of the American constitutional design, James Madison, such diversity within a large territory contributes to a kind of societal equilibrium of passions and interests and makes it more difficult for a majority faction to form. Some of you have studied Federalist Number 10 and are familiar with this theory of a multiplicity of multiplicity of interests and sects that creates a kind of societal equilibrium. To some scholars, Madison's theory of the extended republic and diversification of economic interests and religious sects, in conjunction with his endorsement of the social contract theory, made him a proponent of modern liberalism. Along with other modern liberals, such as Hobbes and Locke, Madison must share the blame, this thesis goes, for the decline of community and civic spiritedness in our time. So in other words, much of what's happening today, we can blame on the founders, and particularly the chief architect, James Madison. In his book, Why Liberalism Failed, for example, Patrick Deneen claims that liberalism is rooted in the separation of the private and public things, the encouragement of selfish interests, and the minimization of civic relationships among individuals. For Deneen, the 18th century American embodiment of these bad ideas was James Madison, whose theory of the extended republic was designed to promote self-interest, fragmentation, and, quote, civic indifference, unquote. In sum, Deneen sees Madison's design for America as encouraging, quote, an acquired ability by citizens to maintain psychic distance in the form of personal identity. Now, if this interpretation is accurate, then Madison's conception of citizenship is, quite frankly, superficial. It's a superficial and hollow one, especially when contrasted with the classical, robust civic model. But I think the problem with Deneen's reading of Madison is that it's fundamentally at odds with Madison's own words and ideas. I think he gets Madison almost wholly wrong. In an essay entitled, quote, A Candid State of Parties, unquote, Madison made clear that divisiveness and conflict are not the ultimate aims of republicanism. Republicans, he said, and this is a big R Republican because he and Jefferson found the Republican Party in 1792. These Republicans that are opposing the Federalists, he said, are in favor of, quote, banishing every other distinction than that between enemies and friends to Republican government, and promoting a general harmony among the latter, wherever residing or however employed, unquote. In fact, the goal of republicanism for Madison was to make what he called a common cause, where there is common sentiment and common interest, and I'm quoting him here, in spite of circumstantial and artificial distinctions. He said the goal of republicanism is for the citizens to make together a common cause, despite their differences in interests and places that they live and various other distinctions. Accordingly, Madison's intent was not to encourage civic indifference or psychic distance between citizens, as Deneen argued. While he did intend the extended republic to make it difficult for a majority faction to communicate and form, this was only part of his purpose. We're all familiar with that kind of diversification in society that makes it difficult for any particular faction to gain a majority. That's part of his plan, but it's only part of his plan. He also conceived of a political environment conducive to the formation and refinement and enlargement of public opinion. When settled, public opinion was to serve as a stabilizing and unifying element of the political order. Thus, unlike other modern thinkers such as Hobbes or I think Montesquieu, though I know Dr. Allen may disagree with me on this, Madison reclaimed the classical idea that each regime has a predominant view of justice that defines the association and its members. He parted ways from the classics, however, in restricting a republic to a small territory. Instead, he envisioned a large republic composed of citizens united by, quote, and these are his words, citizens united by one harmonious interest and common cause, regardless of circumstantial distinctions that characterize an extensive commercial society. What was Madison thinking? What did this man have? What was going on in his head? Did he really think it's possible, even desirable, for there to be a common conception of justice and a common cause in such a large, modern, commercial republic, constituted by such multiplicity and diversity of interests, religions, and views? Did he really think that was desirable, or even was it at all possible? In Madison's creative mind, the dawn of the commercial age was not just one characterized by the exchange of goods. It was also characterized by the commerce, the exchange, the commerce of ideas. This is his phrase that he takes from a French thinker, Jean-Jacques Barthélemy, the commerce of ideas. The new and improved means of travel and communication changed the scope of the practicable sphere of politics, radically altering the notion that only in a small polity could a people govern themselves. Improvements such as, and this is quoting from Madison again, quote, good roads, domestic commerce, a free press, and particularly a circulation of newspapers through the entire body of the people, and representatives going from and returning among every part of them, are equivalent, Madison said, to a contraction of the territorial limits and favor liberty where the limits may be too extensive, unquote. In Madison's political imagination, and you can see him sitting at his desk at Montpelier, looking out the window, or later when he's at Mrs. House's boarding house on the corner of 5th and what used to be called High Street, now Market Street, in his cramped quarters. You know, I mean, he's still a bachelor because he spends most of his time studying and with his books, and he's also very shy, trying to figure out how for the first time in the history of the world, we could find a way for a small R republic to sustain itself, for a people to actually have the chance to govern themselves. In Madison's political imagination, these developments made possible the rescue of Republican government from the diseases to which it had historically been so prone, and offered a new ground of hope for achieving success in the great experiment of self-government. To this end, he enthusiastically welcomed a diversity of economic interests, occupations, and religions in this large territory. Nonetheless, he hoped that the expression of different opinions would, via the deliberative constitutional process he helped to design, result in a consensus of the society on the most fundamental political and moral issues. Indeed, following the classics, he believed that such a consensus necessary for the health and in fact preservation of the political order. As in the ancient world, he believed that this would require robust civic contributions, including leadership roles performed by statesmen and literati, private citizens, that would advance the general harmony and in the interests and affections of the great body of the people. In essence, the old notion that a large territory is an invitation to despotism because the people cannot communicate and unite to defend their liberties had to be rethought in this new age of communication. Now, some of the things that brought about this new age of communication, the printing press, or in transportation, the compass and so on, were discovered earlier, but by the 18th century, this is when this has come to have a real effect in society. And for the first time in the world, there's something that might be called a public. So too, the idea that a republic must be confined to a small territory in order for the citizens to communicate effectively, deliberate, and act collectively. This is precisely what Madison did. He reassessed the issue of the size of a republic, recalibrating the connection between geographical space on the one hand and the effective expression of the public voice on the other, in a world effectively made smaller by new means and ease of communication. We talk that way today, don't we? That the world is a smaller place now with the means of communication accelerating. So the famous theory of the extended republic, attributed to Madison, is indeed a unique and critical thought. But it's perhaps somewhat less exceptional for its proffered cure of majority faction within a society composed of a multiplicity of interests and religious identities, and more extraordinary for its novel treatment of the prospects for Republican government in a new age of communication. Madison believed he had discovered a political design conducive, for the first time in the history of the world, to a fair experiment in self-government and the practice of civic harmony in the modern world. Well, a large population of citizens spread over an extensive territory will certainly not know each other personally. Because of the improved means of communication, they can know each other's views and characters, and they are capable of engaging in deliberative politics. By way of the principle of representation, public opinion can be collected, refined, guided, and given ruling force. Thus, while the citizens do not act collectively in a direct capacity, they do deliberate and act in common. Here's Madison again, quote, "Public opinion sets bounds to every government and is the real sovereign in every free one," unquote. Madison wrote this in 1791 in an essay entitled Public Opinion. In the formation of public opinion, Madison envisioned the people engaging in the ongoing task of making a common cause. Their joint civic labors would generate mutual civic concern. Let me repeat that. Their joint civic labors would generate mutual civic concern, even perhaps bonds of affection, despite the differences that separate them geographically, economically, and religiously. Madison summarized his vision of the work of a Republican citizenry in terms that might soften the heart of even the most confirmed liberal atomist. Quote, and I mean liberal there in the classical liberal sense that veers towards libertarianism. Here's Madison, quote, "Let us eradicate local prejudices and mistaken rivalships to consolidate the affairs of the states into one harmonious interest. And let it be the patriotic study of all, to erect over the whole one paramount empire of reason, benevolence, and brotherly affection," unquote. That's the Madison who's known by some for only wanting divisiveness in society. Now, fast forward 2 centuries. In our society today, modes, speed, and ease of communication communication have burgeoned beyond the wildest imagination of the founding generation. The internet and what it has spawned, email, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, have revolutionized communications across the face of the globe. The size and population of the United States has increased 100-fold, but at the same time, advances in communications technology seem to have outstripped geographical and demographic growth. Think of this space and time kind of axis. And is political communication too fast and too easy today? Is it too easy for people to communicate and unite on the basis of partial interest or prejudice? Remember, Madison's whole idea of the large republic was to make it difficult for people to unite on the basis of partial interest and unjust self-interest and prejudicial passions. The large territory with a larger population would take a lot more work to form a consensus. So it would slow down and it builds in a kind of deliberative factor in order to build a majority. But now communication is almost instantaneous. And so has this become a problem, especially due to the bubble and echo chamber phenomena that have emerged in recent years, in which many people tend to limit their news sources and discussions to those with whom they already disagree. Despite the large size of the country and its numerous population, has a warp speed spread of passion, prejudice, and thoughtless ideology broken down the buttresses of the deliberative processes? Is this part of the reason the nation is so ideologically fragmented today? As we're all well aware, our country is not only currently fractured, but it seems to be divided basically into two critical camps. There are a number of people not taking sides exactly, but into two critical camps that split along partisan and ideological lines. Perhaps, as some have argued, amounting to, quote, two Americas, unquote. Has communication technology, in a sense, recreated the problem of the small republic, in which the two main sides neither listen to nor attempt to accommodate each other? Are we today recreating the oppressive battle between the oligarchs on the one hand and the Democrats on the other hand, the rich versus the poor, the few versus the many? Are we recreating that today in our system of fast communication? But instead of economic class warfare, as between oligarchs and Democrats, ours is a cultural war between an urban, coastal, upper class versus a more rural, middle America. There's some evidence which seems to suggest that rather than promoting public deliberation, the revolution in communications technology that we see in our time has contributed to the narrowing of viewpoints and divisions within society. In another recent study conducted by the Pew Research Foundation, 27% of people surveyed either blocked or unfriended someone because of a political disagreement or something they found offensive on social media. One wonders whether Madison's theory of the extended republic, with its slowing down and cooling effect on the spread of passions as an antidote for the disease of faction, is still viable in the electronic age of instant communication. Have the advances in technology and the rapidity of communication changed the ratio of space and time to the extent that the large republic is now susceptible to the disease of faction? No longer just a small republic that the large republic was meant to solve, but is today the large republic susceptible of the disease the very disease that it was intended to solve? These are procedural questions. The substantive question concerns the nature of this political face-off. So there's one question about what do we do about the processes in America. I mean, all of these things, the complex bicameral legislature and the three branches of government and the large republic and representation and checks and balances, all of this is meant to slow down the process to encourage deliberation, right? And if that's not working anymore, what kind of processes could we put in place there? Are there new processes we could bring in that would help regain a kind of deliberation as a part of this, as a part of the way this works? That's the procedural question. But there's also a substantive question. Is it just rough and tumble politics as usual, the substantive question, where we disagree substantively on these issues? Is it nothing too serious to worry about? Or are we so markedly diverse, fractured, and factionalized in our political and moral views, and in our loves and our hates, that the civic bonds that once held Americans together are too tattered and worn to stave off the gloomy prospect of incurable discord and disintegration? Are, quote, the mystic chords of memory, unquote, too faded, too weak to keep us together as a people? In an era that holds diversity in high esteem, is civic friendship even desirable today? Desirable to the people of America? Is civic concord still something that we strive for? If not, we have to ask ourselves if any political order ever did or ever could sustain itself in the absence of a shared fundamental commitment to a common cause. It's simply not enough to only have in common a dislike for one another. If we still strive for public concord, the procedural question comes back into play. Can an effective deliberative politics, which is essential to civic friendship, be achieved in the political and technological world in which we currently live? Are the means to achieve this at our disposal, or has the social and political world changed so much that in our present age, the means simply do not exist to accomplish this political task? Warp speed communications and echo chambers are indeed factors that may lead to decreased civic deliberation. But the greatest harm to public deliberation and consensus building in the last near century, I think, has been the growth of the administrative state, including the concurrent decline of the power of Congress, the states, and local governments. The weakening of these institutions has impacted the process of forming and refining public opinion. It has also diminished the real authority of public opinion in contemporary American politics. With so many legislative decisions relegated to the administration or perhaps preempted by the Supreme Court, Congress, whose role it is to convey and refine public opinion, is particularly to blame for failing the American people. As important as is the need for Congress and state and local governments to reclaim their roles as crucibles and carriers of public opinion. That's the only way public opinion gets to the fore in a representative democracy. And so it's critical that Congress reclaim that role. But as critical as that is, improvements in political procedure alone will not solve the current crisis. We're in the soup, as the English like to say. The central principle of the polity, manifest in the citizens' fundamental beliefs and opinions about what is just and unjust, right and wrong, ultimately determines the character of free government. And no government by the people can long endure whose citizens have nothing in common but a dislike for one another. In today's United States, comprised of a population of over 300 million, the bonds between citizens are obviously not personal for most Americans. This makes the presence or absence of a shared principle of justice even more critically important. Well, Leon Cities suggestion that civic friendship can serve as an antidote to alienation in modern society, somehow binding together people with the most fundamental disagreements, seems to me untenable. Nevertheless, I would agree that reinvigorating healthy public discourse could contribute much to our current ills. Accordingly, while diversity and toleration cannot ultimately provide the glue that holds society together, it's possible that a certain understanding and practice of freedom can. If the contours of this freedom are not defined and informed by an understanding of what we owe each other as human beings, however, as this is inscribed in the American Compact, it is difficult to imagine what other principles could take its place without succumbing to some variant of despotism. So for people like Hobbes, the social contract is simply the product of the logical dictates of self-interest, most fundamentally understood as a desire for self-preservation. Some of you in this class have been reading this and are very familiar with Hobbes's argument on this. In contrast, Madison conceived of the social contract as both a legal and a moral compact. It involves both natural rights and natural duties. It requires civic reciprocity for Madison. These natural obligations and rights are derived from the essential freedom of the reasoning human mind and God-given conscience, which provides the basis of mankind's capacity for self-government. In an article entitled Property, Madison, by which term Madison meant to convey not only the rights of property, but a property in rights, Madison defined the terms of the social contract. He said this: conscience is more sacred than a man's castle. To a man's conscience we owe a debt of protection for which the public faith is pledged by the very nature and original conditions of the social pact. I want to repeat that. It's a little stilted, but listen to what Madison is arguing. He says, to a man's conscience, each of us owes a debt of protection for which the public faith, public trust, you see, is pledged by the very nature and original conditions of that social pact. So that social pact is not just a legal agreement. It's a pledge of protection. Thus, the most sacred of all property is the right of conscience. In fact, the right of conscience is the purest of natural rights, absolute in its inalienability, all other rights being in part dependent on positive law. The social compact is, as it were, a pledge of every individual to every other individual to protect his right of conscience and the rights that flow from it. This promise, this pledge, this promise, constitutes the civic debt of every member of civil society to every other member. It's the basis of public faith and social trust. Madison's profound concern with the disease of faction can only be truly appreciated when one understands that faction is not merely a problem awaiting an institutional solution. Rather, for Madison, faction is a breaking of the pledge that constitutes the original social pact. Rule by faction is civic betrayal. Madison's goal was to make majority rule just rule, as he termed it in Vices of the Political System, to place power on the side of right. His aspirations for America depended on the capacity of the people to govern themselves, which in turn depended on the willingness of the people to engage in the deliberative processes with the aim to, and in the spirit of, finding common ground. The willingness to engage with one another, despite our differences in perspectives, is the first condition of free government. Prior even to subjecting the public views to the processes designed to regulate and control factious views, reestablishing this primary condition is the challenge we're faced with in America today. It's a challenge of bringing together those who disagree on the most fundamental of political questions in sustained and productive civic dialogue. On one side of the political spectrum today are those who understand the American character and way of life as grounded in the permanent human things, often expressed as natural law and natural rights. These people are generally on the right side of the political spectrum, though there are certainly people on the left who adhere to the idea of a standard of justice, independent of individual desires or cultural distinctions. And many of these people form that part of the left, in fact, that still call themselves liberals and who have not endorsed all that progressivism on the new hard left embraces. On the other side of the political spectrum are those who reject the notion of natural law and the permanent human things, who instead view the challenge before us as an historical mission to address past injustices by way of an evolving morality of diversity and inclusion. The progressives of the left are the standard bearers of this view, which is manifest today in the emphasis on such things as social justice, identity politics, and social and gender constructs. These contrasting perspectives are deeply rooted in divergent philosophical and, for some, theological principles, which clash over the very meaning and purpose of human life. As we saw in the diverse examples, nope, I'm going to skip that because I took that out to make this shorter. We're not going to see in those diverse examples. The chasm of these rival perspectives is deeply entrenched and will not be easily bridged, if it can be spanned at all. Given the foundational character of the disagreement, it's not surprising that each side thinks the other would destroy the common good, or that many feel enmity for their political opponents' views, if not for their opponents themselves. The task before America today is certainly a daunting one. But we have, after all, faced tough challenges as a nation before. At the close of the Revolutionary War, George Washington told his fellow citizen soldiers that someday Americans would look back to that moment of history they occupied, quote, when the United States came into existence as a nation, unquote. Whether Americans will be a happy or a miserable people would depend on their choice and conduct, Washington told them. Quote, this is the time of your political probation. This is the moment to establish or ruin your national character forever. In 1861, the nation faced another trial for survival, with the Union on the brink of dissolution. To all Americans, North and South, Lincoln pleaded, we are not enemies. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. This is fitting and good advice for us today. Once again, we live in the moment of our political probation. As our progenitors understood, no regime can sustain itself on the basis of dry, legalistic agreement alone. The American Social Compact is not only a legal agreement, as I've said, but a moral one, and it is the latter which ultimately makes the former binding and obligatory. In accepting the mantle of American citizenship, whether explicitly or tacitly, each of us makes a pledge to every other American, based on the acknowledgement and respect for the other's humanity, accepting the moral obligations that flow from that acknowledgement. This appreciation constitutes the central idea of the Declaration of Independence, and it informs the pledge that is at the core of the American Compact, that is, the American Constitution. In this way, we the people form a more perfect union, a genuine union, that is much more than a mere collection of individuals and groups. This pledge, this promise of public faith, is what makes Americans one people and constitutes the vital bonds of our civic friendship. In a 1955 address, to the students at Dartmouth College, I'm going to switch gears now as I conclude. Robert Frost, my favorite American poet, recited a poem that most of us are quite familiar with. But even though you've heard it recited probably many times, maybe even recited the words yourself, there might be an idea in it that you haven't seen before, but that is worth thinking about. The idea is the promise, the American promise. Whose woods are these? Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to see his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. When Frost finished reciting this poem, he remarked, quote, "Now everybody suspected there was something in that line, but I have promises to keep. They kept at me about it, and so I've decided to have a meaning for it. Promises may be divided into two kinds," Frost said, "those I make for myself and those my ancestors made for me, known as the social contract." This apparently casual construal of this poem by Frost was, of course, the expression of a deeply considered idea. In this frame capturing a solitary figure pausing on his journey home at the edge of snow-swept woods on the winter solstice, Frost reminds us of the American promise. He prompts us to remember, like the halting man in the depths of solitude and separateness recalled, that we are part of a long line of generations of citizens who made a promise to one another. With this recollection in mind, the man made his way along to the fellowship of the village. Like him, we have pledged to live together in a community according to a way of life we deem worthy of our ideas and aspirations. In the poet's talk in Hanover on that stormy spring morning of 1955, Frost remembered his own promise, and in so doing reminds us, his friends and fellow citizens, that we too have promises to keep. Thank you.
Wonderful. Now, as I said at the outset, this is when we open for discussion. I don't think it needs to be heavily moderated. If you don't mind, I'll put it in your hands.
That's fine.
Okay, but we begin with the undergraduates, so go for it.
And you undergraduates know I'm patient, so. Take your time. Ian.
I guess I'm curious if you think there's any way that we could adjust the way that we elect our representatives, where they can more accurately represent the constituents, where maybe it's not centered around location, but more so like similarly, not that it's possible to communicate.
So Ian, let me make sure I understand. Do you think that our representatives in Congress are not representing well the interests and views of their constituents?
Well, I guess what I'm thinking is that now there's so many small factions that have formed through the internet where people don't live together, but they have similar interests that have united on a different plane other than location.
Mm-hmm.
That's not to say that we don't also currently have adequate representation based on location.
My guess is, and tell me what you think, certainly in the House of Representatives, with the election cycle being really nonstop, they feel a heavy pressure to represent the views of their constituents. They take polls all the time. They campaign for great lengths of time, which seems to grow each year. So I think that they're very keyed into representing their constituents. And the Senate, of course, less so, but still, they have to stand for direct election too. It's more that Congress has abdicated so much of their responsibility, partly because they feel like they'll get in trouble and won't get elected again if they take a hard stand. And so they're happy for the administrative state, for the bureaucracy, to take on a lot of the tough questions and not to provide a whole lot, to make laws that are, omnibus bills that don't say a whole lot, and you leave it to the bureaucracy to let people be upset with them when they don't like something. So I think that's more the problem than not, listening to their constituents. Does that make sense? Yeah. Now, what can we do about that? The growth of, that's why, the growth of the administrative state, the reason that concerns me so much is because it's a zero-sum game, I think, with individual self-government. So the more the state is centralized and controls so many aspects of our lives, the less we govern ourselves. So for Madison, for example, this whole idea of having states and localities was to disperse power so it wouldn't be so centralized. Why was that important? Well, it was partly because it was the tradition of the 13 colonies became 13 states. All that's true. But there was actually a principle to it. It wasn't just based on that's the way it's always been. It had to do with collecting the public voice so that public opinion could check government, by which he means the people. It has to do with preserving the authority of the people so that it's not what might be called a ghostly body politic, that it's not supposed to be the people are sovereign in name only. Madison meant for the people to genuinely be sovereign, and that's why it was so important to him to create a system with all this complexity and layers so that public opinion could be refined and enlarged along the way. How do we do that today when Congress has abdicated so much of their responsibility and so much of the decision-making is in the hands of people who aren't elected, who are career civil servants? Problem. So I'm going to come to other people in a moment, but I'm going to hold out for just a moment longer to see if any other students want to ask a question. And of course, you can come in later on and ask a question as well. Noah, and then we'll come over here. Yeah.
I guess this is only sort of relevant, but I'm kind of curious, given how much you talked about geography and the democracy in general, what's your view on the Electoral College and the Senate as they relate to geography? Is that something you see as problematic or no?
So, as they relate to geography.
Yeah, they're so now not as many people, people are very concentrated in specific parts of the country.
Oh, yeah.
And our electoral systems haven't necessarily evolved. Is that something you feel like they need to do?
So I'm not sure I'm understanding you exactly, so stop me if I'm not.
I think I might not be explaining it very well.
Well, we'll work on this together. Okay. So do you mean that the split in people who tend to go for the red or people who tend to go for the blue, that's geographically split up across the country on the coast versus?
No, I just mean people used to be spread across the country more evenly. And that's sort of, as I see it, I could be wrong, please correct me if I'm wrong. As I see it, that's what a lot of our electoral system is built on, is that idea that people are spread across relatively evenly. And that's become way less true in our relatively recent.
Because of the concentration in urban areas on the coast and so on.
Are you asking about the Electoral College?
So,
And the Senate. I was.
well, so I think what that gets to is the idea that the Senate is not based on proportional representation.
Yeah, that would be.
And so it's not exactly one man, one vote, and the Electoral College reflects that to the extent it reflects the equality of the states in the Senate. It takes away from the one man, one vote. So, for example, Delaware has a bigger presence in the Electoral College, proportionate to their population than California has. So you think maybe Californians are being gypped in the Electoral College.
I'm asking what you think about that.
Okay. Well, that's what some people are saying, right? And this is a big debate today about whether we should keep or abolish the Electoral College. But that's part of the refinement and enlargement, isn't it, of the views. This whole idea of one man, one vote, as if we'd be a direct democracy if we only could be. We could be today if we want to be. It's easy with communication. Ross Perot thought of this back in the 1990s when, when everybody could have a telephone. Now with the internet, we could all just punch in our vote. Would that be better? Would we be better off if it was just based on one man, one vote, rather than any of this refining and enlarging? Well, my own view on that is not exactly, for the very reasons that Madison gives, that, and for the problems we're facing now with too easy communication that tends to be a thoughtlessness in our political opinions. We human beings, look, what happens politically is the same thing that happens with us individually. We sometimes make snap judgments, and we wish we thought a little bit longer about them, right? Well, politics groups can do that too. And the easier the group can communicate, the more they're apt to do that. That was the whole problem with the ancient polities. That it was just one faction ruling after another. Whoever was in power would oppress the other. I don't think that is the way we want to do things in the United States, if there is such a thing as a substantive idea of justice. It's not just the question of who gets to say and how quickly they get to decide, but the need to slow things down so that, as Fisher Ames put it, we have not just a first quick thought, but a sober second thought, and try to make decisions on the basis of justice and the general good. That's not so much the question of one man, one vote, as the question of layering the political system. Now, states are one way to do that. Madison and James Wilson at the Constitutional Convention actually wanted the Senate to be based on proportionate representation, so that it would be fairer proportionally. That, they said, was the true small R Republican model. They lost. So I think theoretically they're right that that's a better model to base it on proportionate representation. But there were states that would have none of it, including, New Jersey and Delaware and some of the states close to where I come from back in Pennsylvania. I think it's a little late in the game to change that. It's possible to reconsider it, but the Electoral College itself, as an institution, a way to elect a president, I think has served us well for years and will in the future. Yes, sir.
You talked a lot about, the idea of like a common view of humanity, a common view of is there something that you think the left and the right can agree on in terms of a common view of humanity? What's the kernel that can base?
I hope so, but that's something we need to listen to each other more, so that the conversation continues and we can talk about. Right now, what I think part of the problem is, among the intellectual class who think of themselves as intellectual elites, I do not count myself as part of that, by the way. There's a new way of thinking that rejects the whole idea of nature. and so rejects the idea of human nature as well. And so what is left is simply power. So the idea of talking about right and wrong, or things like justice or ethics, becomes meaningless. But if that becomes meaningless, then what's the purpose of a political order? What it means is that the old Declaration of Independence, its fundamental teaching becomes meaningless as well, because that declaration is based on a particular understanding of human nature, that no human being has the right to rule another human being by nature. So that's what opens up the whole possibility and challenge of free government and self-government. If no human being has the right to rule another human being by nature, then what's required for government? Consent. But that consent that's required for government, that social compact, you see, carries with it an obligation to treat every other human being as an end in of himself or herself, as a human being. That then brings up the question, right? What does it mean to be human? What kinds of things are consistent with humanity? Because perhaps not everything is. And that forces us to address that kind of standard of what it means to be human. And human beings aren't just a bundle of desires that we should get anything and everything we want. Everything we want and everything we desire is not a right. Because if everything is a right, nothing is a right. So what that does is impose on us the challenge of thinking through those questions. And if we do that, we're probably all going to find that there are some answers to some of those questions we don't like. And then we're going to have to struggle with them as a people, just as we had to in the 1860s. We have to face that struggle again of what it means to be human and what kind of responsibilities, as tough as they are, that imposes on us, and are we willing to accept that? I'm not sure how we go forward without doing that. What can serve as a standard of justice for us that can preserve an idea of humanity and human dignity, if not humanity itself? Linda.
I was just going to piggyback on the question raised back here about representation when someone goes into the legislature or goes to D.C.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the beginning of our country, people would put down their pen, their hoe, their shovel, and they would go and serve in the Congress or in their state house. But now you find more professional politicians who stay there, and some are good at staying there, whether it's in the state house or D.C. But some lose sight of what their people need and want because they've become professional political fixtures.
Mm-hmm.
So did you see that when you were in the legislature in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, to some extent. But, actually what I saw and was surprised by, even more than that, was how decent most ordinary legislators are. That they have families and they're trying to make ends meet, and they're actually trying to do what they can for their constituents. Because the rank and file tend to be pretty decent folks. And some of the people in positions of power are as well, and some maybe not so much. And so if we're talking about the question of corruption among our politicians, I don't know if it's there so much because of time spent per se. As much as not really, for many of them, they're really, it's part of it's trying to get reelected and the constant clamor to just tell your constituents, actually the opposite of what we were talking about, to give your constituents everything they want. And so if you can't do it through the policy, you do a lot of constituent service. And so for a lot of legislators, constituent service is almost everything. Because you help somebody on PennDOT, or what do they call it here in Colorado? Your transportation. Doesn't matter what party they are, you have their vote forever. Because you call those people, and something that would take an ordinary person weeks to get, it's done within 24 hours. This is the way I think all the states do this, which I was surprised at. I didn't know about any of this when I went there. So I think it's not so much time that does have an effect of trying to get reelected. That can be corrupting. I don't know, I'm trying to think this through, Linda, because I think I'm thinking of folks I knew and how they did things, and a lot of them don't know why they're there, I think. They just don't know exactly why they're there, other than only simply to try to do constituent service and be reelected. I think we've lost a little bit of the idea in the country in general, and perhaps this is partly the fault of political science departments who are educating the people who get degrees, and it's oftentimes those people running for office, that in the law schools. We don't really have a lot of an idea that we're teaching anymore about what it would mean to be a good political leader. We talk leadership all the time. And all we tend to mean by it is to somehow be out in front of people. But what's the purpose of leadership? Why are you ahead? Where are you leading? We don't teach that in our universities these days. The old way to say it is statesmanship. And there's really a rich body of literature. And I think there are a lot of young people hungry for that, who then, if they went on into public service, because there's a desire to give, I think we need to better equip our young people with at least the questions regarding these things in our colleges, so that it's something worth thinking about. I don't know. What do you think, Ian? What do you think? Do you feel like that's something that would be important to have if you're thinking about going into public service?
Yeah, I agree that it's, I don't know if I've encountered I'm sitting about personally, it's going to be politics.
Yeah.
Personally, desire for it.
What's the job of the politician besides winning election? Maybe it's time for us in our education to start to reclaim thinking about that. Thank you, Linda.
Is this maybe a time to readdress or address term limits? I personally don't agree with it, but a number of things you said that we've talked about that people are concurring with, I believe, term limits tends to be counter to some of those negatives. Now, I happen to like the ballot box myself for term limits, but
I don't have a problem with term limits per se. I know Bill Allen years ago talked about this, and I listened very closely to what he said, as I always did. And he said term limits at the state level could make a lot of sense, but maybe at the national level, not so much. I think partly because, for example, in the Senate, you really want people there with knowledge and a certain consistency. I mean, Publius talks about this in the Federalist Papers, right? Particularly in terms of our foreign policy, that it's important for us to have some people who are very knowledgeable and maybe a desire to have a certain consistency in our foreign policy, or at least to try to have some of that vis-a-vis the executive. So those are considerations, at least, in terms of term limits, things to think about. At the state level, you don't deal with foreign policy. So the most important issues at the state level are basically education and health and human services. And it's not so critical there. It's not really all that critical, especially if local school boards, if they retain a lot of that authority over education, which they have less and less authority as states usurp more and more. But so at the state level, if people want term limits, have them. I mean, either way, I think the elections do a pretty good job of keeping in who you want and getting out, getting the bums out. There's a lot of turnover in state houses. There's a lot of turnover in state houses. I hardly know any, I do know a few people, there's some who stay there forever, in the Pennsylvania House. People serve for a time and then they tend to go and do other things, not just because they're defeated, but because some of them are burnt out. You don't live at home half the time, for one thing. And I mean, it's a lot of work if you do the job right. Marty.
That's really a great lecture. Turned it into a class. I was trying to jot some words down that came up besides friendship, and trust came up quite often in your lecture. And I'm just sort of thinking that you talk about friendliness, you talk about friendship.
Yes.
Very different. And
you've been reading Aristotle.
And I was thinking about my own personal friendships. Where did they come from? Where were they born from?
Yeah.
Aside from family, I'm going to say we don't often think about family and friendship, but there's that there too. But I think about formative times, like if you're a student, your friendships often start in college. Common shared experiences, traditions that you each come back to, and that even if you haven't seen the person in 10 or 20 or 30 years, you pick up the conversation like it never ended. Why? Because you shared something, there was a tradition. And that story stays with you. And that story is important. You retell the story and you keep visiting. That friendship is strengthened by the storytelling. And you trust each other in the storytelling. You're saying the same shared experiences, and they mean pretty much the same thing to each of you. So I think about some of our politics, our debates about, we still haggle over the original intent of the founders. We haggle about what it means to be an American in a way that almost seems more visual than perhaps you know better, whether it's more visual now than it was 100 years ago, whether it's become more nasty and more divisive rather than seeking the truth in the matter. So if we start jabbering at our traditions, things that we should have in common, that we should all trust in ourselves to agree upon, it's no wonder that we struggle with being in friendship anymore.
Yeah.
I'm not wondering if you have some thoughts about it. This is back to the political science or political philosophy of how do we interpret our founding, where we all were rooted together, and what it means to be Americans from birth to what it means to be Americans today.
Well, lots of questions involved in that question with layers. Politics, this is not the first time politics is a nasty business. It's been a nasty business many times throughout history. I remember some of you commenting in the Lincoln-Douglas class about how Lincoln seemed to pretty much hold on to a notion of civility, but Douglas sometimes really was sort of pushing in a way that you might consider at times not particularly civil. Time of the founding, Jefferson and Hamilton, they just really didn't like each other. And people would, when parties first started in America, would go to the other side of the street to avoid having to tip your hat as you passed your political opponent. And you've always seen political cartoons, and you can see how vitriolic they are sometimes. But still, civility, to the extent that we can do that and genuinely listen to each other, goes a long way. Because it's the first condition of political discourse. As we learn in the first book of Plato's Republic, right? You can't persuade anybody of anything if the other person's not listening or if you're not listening. So first of all, there's got to be genuine listening and a genuine dialogue, discourse. That's number one. But the whole thing about the disagreement over the founding that we have today and how original intent and so on, I think the problem there, Marty, is that there's something going on there. There's really one could put the disagreement that's going on today this way. There's a lot of different ways you could phrase it. But one way to phrase it is that we're disagreeing over the meaning of the Declaration of Independence. I saw an MSNBC ad the other day that said it was all beautiful music-filled background, and it says, this is who we are. And they're citing the Declaration, and they're interpreting it in a way that's very different, for example, than how some other people interpret it. In one sense, we're disagreeing over the very meaning and purpose of the Declaration, and thus the meaning and purpose of our nation, of America. In a very similar way, as in a very fundamental way, just as we were in the 1850s. And remember, in the 1850s, I know you know this, one way to talk about the disagreement was to say it was a disagreement over the meaning of the Declaration of Independence and the mission of the country. Yes, sir.
So, the question I wrestle with a lot is what's fundamentally different today in the dissension in our society, you just answered, than it was two periods that I lived through that were terribly disruptive.
Yeah.
The civil rights movement, the violence therein, and our streets on fire, and how society was torn by the Vietnam War, and our fundamental role of the military and our institutions were, and there was violence in the streets for that too. And today, it's not yet violence in the streets, although some are predicting it. What is fundamentally more disruptive and of greater dissension today? Because that's sort of what is being posited here than was during the Vietnam era, during the Civil Rights era. And I think of that a lot, and I can't come up with it. And what you just said is that we're fundamental. One is that are we really fundamentally arguing what the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution was? That, if that's the case, that would be reflecting a deeper division in our society, but I'm not convinced of it.
Well, over the meaning of, I think we're using the same terms, especially the term equality, and meaning very different things. And if you flesh that out, it's a difference of how we should live our lives. And that's fundamental. And I think what was happening in the civil rights movement, it wasn't a disagreement over the meaning of what it means to be human, or necessarily over how we live our lives, but whether we were going to recognize that statement in the Declaration that all men are created equal and bring our way of life into practice with it. I don't think we were disagreeing about the question so much as the practice. Today we're just disagreeing about the question itself, our answers to the question itself. So it's not just we fundamentally agree on what America stands for, and we just got to get our practices in line with this. No, we disagree on what America stands for. I think that's what's going on. Now, is there a way that we could smooth out the edges? Is it not as bad as fundamental as that? Is there a way for us to come together and agree upon a common way of life based on common political principles? That's the challenge before us. But I think in order for us to have any chance of doing it, there's going to have to be an awful lot of listening, and both sides are. I don't see how we can do it right now where each side is. Something's got to give. I think that was the name of a movie. Something's got to give. Colin.
So what you've said several times now about the purpose of America. What do you mean the purpose of America? And the common way of life that you just talked about, what is that?
Wow.
Because I'm also just
Great question.
You started this.
Easy peasy question, right? What's the purpose of
Your
America?
initial premise, or one of your initial premises in this discussion was that the two sides hate each other, right?
Well, that's what polls are showing. They were doing polls, and that's what people are saying. So the question, Colin, is what is the purpose of America? Does that seem to you to be a kind of a, maybe we shouldn't talk about purposes?
I'm just curious because I never really thought about the country as having a purpose. Right? And I've asked this question before about, what it is to be an American, what are the attributes of an American, and you just said common way of life that we can't seem to agree on, which seems to me that you're saying that certain portions of the country are living not in accordance with the right way, the purpose, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So I'm curious now, can you define what those things are so that we can have a better understanding of where the disagreement comes?
Yeah. It's a great question. Let me see if I can answer it by answering it by asking you a question, Colin. Think of pre-Civil War America, when the United States was on the brink of dissolution, and in fact, after Lincoln's election, there was dissolution, certainly civil war, right? What Lincoln was fighting against people like Douglas and Taney and others about, this is on my mind because I'm teaching a class on it this semester. He thought that if you had the campaign slogan that what America stood for was popular sovereignty, let every state and territory decide for themselves on the question of slavery, right? Lincoln thought that undermined what he called the central idea, which he meant the purpose, the fundamental principle of what the country stands for. He thought that you couldn't just say, let people decide what they want on a question of slavery, because it undermined the purpose of America, which he called, he said this in his speech against Taney and the Dred Scott decision. He said the purpose of the country is expressed in the Declaration of Independence and the idea that all men are created equal. He said that what that did was it set up a standard maxim, by which he means a standard of justice, an idea of justice that we are to labor for, constantly approximate, and though perhaps never perfectly attained, that standard, that purpose, serves a purpose, that is to give hope to all peoples of all colors everywhere. I would say that's the purpose of America.
But I would argue that the Declaration of Independence could not possibly have meant all people of all colors.
That's what Taney argued.
But I can't. And also earlier you talked about how there's something about no human has the right to rule another human, and that's somehow built into the Constitution of the country. That's very easily said when you discount major portions of your population as human. So I'm curious now, as you're going back and sort of
why is saying the right thing necessarily discounting? Because in practice, everyone hasn't lived up to it. Isn't it important to say that there's a standard that we ought to try to live up to?
Well, I think, in my opinion, I think the standard has changed. I think that we are looking back at that document and wanting to revise it to include the groups that it did not originally include. And in some cases, to talk to this man's question, those groups or factions, as they may be called, LGBTQ and various other now sort of interesting side groups, and I apologize for saying it that way because it's not being derogatory, but the number of groups that are looking to be included in those statements seems to be growing. So first it was women, then it's race, and now it's all these other things. But that's not what the founders had in mind, is it?
Let me just respond very, very briefly by quoting Lincoln. you should beware doing such violence to the unmistakable plain language of the Declaration of Independence. It set up a standard maxim, and though it didn't mean to say that all men were actually enjoying that equality at that time. In fact, the founders had no power to confer such a boon. Rather, they meant to set up a standard maxim that could be looked to by all, labored for by all, and constantly approximated, and spreading its influence to all peoples of all colors everywhere. Yes, in fact, I think Lincoln was right. I would civilly disagree with you. I don't think Taney's interpretation of the Declaration of Independence or Stephen Douglas's was the correct one. I think Lincoln got it right, that the Declaration said what it means, and it meant what it said, and in fact, it still does today.
I'm going to interrupt us only for a moment. It is perfectly all right to continue this discussion. There is a modest set of refreshments outside, and I'm sure Dr. Sheehan will be happy to remain and speak with us one-on-one as we do that, but the time has come for us to give her thanks and to say we will draw to a close the formal portion of the presentation.
Problem is, it's all non-alcoholic, is that correct? With this discussion?
You had two terms there. The word is, I understood. The word problem, I did not.
Thank you, Bill.